So we'll be starting the immune system part today. This is still the same chapter as the lymphatic system was included in. We'll just pick up with this. And that's where I want to go. Oh, shoot. Oh, shoot. Okay. Let me try this. I want to pull up presentation stuff, and I'm forgetting my login for that real quick. So, is there not a search? No, come on. Okay, so what I'm trying to do here is pull up a presentation that doesn't have my voiceover on it, because that would sort of get in the way of what I'm trying to say. So what is... There we go. Okay, so actually what I'm about to show you, come to think of it, I changed a little bit for a couple of reasons, and you can see the changes in the online content material, but I'll just stick with what I have here. If for no other reason, just so that my voice isn't coming out of the speakers up there as well as out of my mouth here. So to begin with, talking about the immune system, I want to just introduce what immune function is. This presentation is sort of carrying on from the lymphatic stuff that we basically did last time, well, last Tuesday. And so the point I want to make here is partly that this chapter that's the lymphatic system and the immune system is misleading, and I think I kind of made this point at the beginning of the lymphatic stuff, that it's not a perfect correlation or matchup between the two. A lot of immunity does have to do with lymphatic system anatomy, but the lymphatic system has its own functions to it, the draining the excess fluid and the transporting dietary lipids, which have nothing to do with immunity. And then on top of that, immunity involves structures that are beyond just the lymphatic system. The main players in immunity are white blood cells, and so they are obviously blood cells, and blood is part of the cardiovascular system. And they get transported around the body in part through the cardiovascular system in the blood. They also do travel through the lymphatic system. And there are white blood cells that are found in lymphatic organs like lymph nodes and the tonsils and that sort of thing. Another player in immune function is a cell called a dendritic cell, which you have already been introduced to one example of that, which is in the skin. Now, when I'm teaching about the skin, I call this cell a dendritic cell because that's what it is. But the classical name for the cell, what you might have picked up when you were learning about the skin in AP1, is that it's called the cell of Langerhans, or the Langerhans cell. That name only tells you that Dr. Langerhans discovered it. It doesn't tell you anything about what that cell does. So I prefer to use dendritic cell, which is not the most descriptive name, but it does connect that cell in the skin with the same type of cells found elsewhere. Basically, anywhere that there's a barrier that things that are going to make us sick have to get across, so that'd be the skin or the lining or the digestive tract or something like that, there are dendritic cells, and we'll see a lot of those. And those cells are parts of those systems. They're not part of the lymphatic system. They're part of immunity, which is the function, but it's, again, using a different organ system's anatomy to play a role. Also, the last thing in this list says interstitial fluid, which is to say that any tissue in your body is going to play a role in immunity, because usually an infection that gets into our body is going to be represented by components that are in that tissue, and the immune system response is going to go to that tissue to have an effect. So really, the immune system is just a functional system. It's not like the other things that we call systems. So it's not the autonomic system or the endocrine system or the cardiovascular system or the digestive system or the reproductive system that we're studying this semester. It's just a series or a set of functions that help to protect the body. It's in this chapter with the lymphatic system because a lot of the anatomy that's responsible for those functions is found in the lymphatic system. But the point I'm making here is that the functions are spread out across all of the systems of your body to some extent. And there are certain players in those functions that are more directly associated with something else, like the cardiovascular system or the digestive system. So we want to be aware of that to some degree. Now, something that often gets lost as we're talking about the immune system in a lecture sort of presentation like this is that the system is an integrated whole. We're going to be thinking about the parts of the immune response, but you need to keep in mind that everything that we're going to end up talking about happens together. A possibly analogous situation is blood clotting, which we've studied before. Blood clotting is just blood clotting, but we learned it as taking part, having three components to it: the vascular spasm, the platelet blood, and coagulation. However, all of those things are happening at the same time. The blood vessels contracting, the platelets are plugging up the hole, and the clotting factors are going through the reactions to form the fiber mesh. All of that happens at once. That is blood clotting. But for the sake of studying, we have to separate it up into a few different parts. And students will often think that part one happens first, and then part two happens, and then part three happens. But in fact, in blood clotting, all three things start at the same time. Part one finishes first, or has reached its culmination first. Part two finishes next, and part three takes the longest. They all start together. They're all happening at the same time. It's just some things happen faster. The immune response is the same way. It's an integrated whole. When you have disease or damage to your body responds to that by in what we call the immune response. We're going to study it, taking it apart into different parts, different aspects of that response. But don't think of it that the first thing that we study is the first thing that happens, and the second thing that we study is the second thing that happens, et cetera, et cetera. Everything happens together. It's an integrated whole. And I will try to, at the end, to come back and show how the last things that we study in regards to the immune response tie into the first things that we study. We can see how they're all kind of wrapped up together. I hope that I'll be able to make that point at the end of this. Okay. Now, this figure is out of another book, and you can see that there's a copyright mark down at the bottom. I have recreated the concept that this is getting at slightly differently, and that's what's in the presentations that you can watch online that have my voiceover, which the way that I reimagine this figure is meant to make a couple of points that this figure sort of leaves out. This figure kind of goes with that idea of just saying that the immune response is an integrated whole, but we're going to have to look at it in breaking it down into smaller parts to understand what's going on. The main difference that we have between the two, within the immune response, is that there's two major components to it. What's called innate immunity and adaptive immunity. So one problem I have with this picture is that innate immunity is a little box that makes it seem like it's less important than adaptive immunity, which is a big box. And you need to just understand that that's not a good representation of how these two fit together. And having said that, let me just pull back out here and show you everything that we're talking about. This little box here is what we're going to look at for innate immunity, and this bigger box over here is what we're going to look at for adaptive immunity. So it's not uncommon, just in organizing this kind of information, to make the innate immunity part seem like a smaller aspect of things. Really what it is that the innate immunity is the more straightforward part of things, and adaptive immunity is a bit more complicated. So we have to sort of allocate more to explaining that and putting it together. And it will cause students to think that that's the important part of immunity, but really it's all an integrated whole, and all of this works together. Like I just said, I hope at the end I'll be able to show you how the last thing that I'm going to talk about ties back to the first thing that I'm going to talk about, which is to say that innate immunity is actually, while it's sort of the first line of defense against things, it's also controlled by adaptive immunity. And we'll see how that fits together, hopefully, to some degree. We'll spend some more time talking about these things. But here I'm just introducing what the overall concepts are. Innate immunity is what we're born with. That's what innate means. And so those are aspects of your system that are ready to protect you from disease or injury from the get-go. It's as simple as our skin. It's just a barrier that things aren't supposed to get across. And there are also some dedicated cells that play a role as sort of the police force, if you will, fighting off potential things that can make our system go haywire. Adaptive immunity is more involved to explain. There's a lot going on to it. And it's also something that we're not born with. It's something that has to come online after a little while, because it involves adapting to our environment. So that part of your immune system needs some time to get used to what it's going to be asked to do over the course of your life. Now, the adaptive immune system needs the first 6 months to 2 years or so of your life to learn what your environment's like. Okay? And then it adapts to things. And then to some degree throughout your whole life, it's adapting to what you're exposed to. So in that first couple of years of your life, you might not be exposed to a potential pathogen because it doesn't exist or something like that. But then later on in your life, you're exposed to it, and you develop an immunity against it because you adapt to it in your environment. Now, I want to talk about that and a few other aspects for a second within the context of this figure, because, well, there's not really a good place to present that idea later on. So this is a good place to talk about it. And I think it'll fit into a little bit of what the difference between innate and adaptive immunity is about. So in this figure, they have within the adaptive immunity box, smaller boxes, which are active and passive immunity. Now, the same thing can be said about innate immunity, that there's active and passive components to it. They're not quite the same idea of active and passive, but I think my version that I have in the online presentation stuff does include active and passive innate immunity. But here, for adaptive immunity, active means something that your body's doing to adapt to its environment. And passive means that some other system adapted to this environment, and you're getting the benefit of that adaptation. Okay. And then within each of these, there's the naturally acquired and the artificially induced versions. So let me start with the passive immunity. Like I said, adaptive immunity is not online immediately. So during the first 6 months to 2 years of your life, the way that you have any kind of immunity along these lines is through a passive introduction. And that's what's called naturally acquired passive immunity here, which is to say that your mother's adaptive immune system adapted to its environment, and when you were an infant, you benefited from her adaptation to the environment by acquiring defenses directly from her. Some of those happen in utero. There's a transfer of immunity across the placental system, I guess is the way to say it. That whatever your mother was immune to, you acquired some of that immunity from her. And that naturally acquired passive immunity that you get from your mother continues as breastfeeding takes place, because some of that immunity can be transferred on there. Now, breastfeeding is a controversial topic. There's arguments to be made on either side of whether breastfeeding is important. One of the things that's often included is about immunity. I'm not entirely positive how this exactly works, but my understanding is that a lot of the naturally acquired passive immunity is actually placental or in utero transfer. And the benefits of breastfeeding can supplement that, but are not entirely required. Basically, whatever the mother's immune to when she's gestating the baby is going to be transferred in utero. After birth, then if she acquires any new immunities, then she'll be able to transfer that on. How often that happens after the baby's born, but before the baby's immune system's ready to fend for itself, it's hard to say. Okay. Now, I have some personal experience in this right now. My son was born in January. Here, only 2 or so months later, everybody's getting all sorts of sick. There's a couple of different things going around, a stomach bug and some sort of respiratory ailment. My wife actually didn't feel very good. Did I cancel class with you guys last week?
No.
No?
No.
What day was that? Oh, that's right. It was Wednesday. So the Wednesday people, you had your practical, and I left and somebody proctored it, and I canceled my afternoon class. But I canceled because my wife was homesick with the stomach bug thing that's going around, and so I had to go home and take care of that. Now, our son doesn't seem to have gotten sick. So her adaptive immune system was dealing with whatever was making her feel under the weather that day. And so hopefully she transferred her immunity that she was developing to that pathogen directly to him through breastfeeding, hopefully. If not, then we're gonna have some very messy diapers in the near future. But no, I think the incubation period's passed. I don't think it's gonna be a problem with him. So there is a possibility that some exposure after birth, but before his immune system is possible, and the mother's immune system adapting for itself can transfer that immunity through the breast milk. But how common that is, I'm not quite sure. I've heard stories of the kind of stomach bug problems that other people have had, and my wife did not have it nearly that bad. So my expectation is that she actually had a fairly decent immunity to that, and she just got exposed to it. She swears up, down, left, and right that it was because we went to visit the child care daycare center, and she picked up something there. I don't think that's true, because
That's true.
Kids are
It's
nasty.
completely.
no, I understand the idea of the petri dish environment that is a daycare, but we were there for a very short time. We did not have a whole lot of contact with any surfaces in the room. I didn't get sick. He didn't get sick. Our son didn't get sick. So she just has this tendency to just figure when she gets sick, it has to be something specific. But just as easily, it could have been that she went in to have lunch with some coworkers one day, and she might have picked up something from somebody, at work or something like that. No way to say exactly how it happened, but anyways, she didn't get a very involved stomach bug out of that. So I think she already had some immunity to it. It just wasn't quite perfect. So she probably already passed some of that on. Now, the other side of passive immunity is artificially induced, which I don't have any personal experience or stories to suggest about this, but the best example I have of this, which I've never had any personal experience with and never met anybody with it either, this is when you're exposed to something that's potentially dangerous to your system, and there's not enough time for you to adapt to it. Now, this is not just about that newborn infant level of being ready to adapt to your system, but just any time during your life, there are going to be some situations where you're not able to adapt to things in enough time to fight off any disease. And the best example of that would be snake bite. If you're bitten by a snake, a poisonous snake, that poison, the toxin that the snake produces and injected into you through its fangs, is going to have bad effects on your body long before your immune system can ever deal with it. Okay? The toxin that gets into your system will start destroying neurons and that sort of thing, and potentially cause death or something much faster than your immune system can adapt to it. So you have to get an artificially induced passive immunity through a snake bite kit. So in a snake bite kit, there's a little ampule of anti-venom serum that contains antibodies against snake venom toxin, and you get an injection of that really quick, and suddenly you're immune to that thing, ideally. And that'll help protect you from the effects of the toxin until you can clear it out of your system. There's no way that your immune system could respond that quickly to a completely novel toxin. And other than inoculating yourself to that by getting small snake bites over a long period of your life, there's no way that your immune system can. So you have to borrow that immunity from somewhere else. And so that snake venom toxin serum, that's what I'm trying to say, in a snake bite kit, it basically contains the immunity that you need. Okay, so that's artificially induced passive immunity. The one thing in here that's the hardest for me to kind of get a good impression of, but because I don't have any experience with that, any stories. There are other situations where you can maybe have a viral infection that's just ravaging your body, and you go into the hospital and they give you some sort of treatment that is an antiviral serum or immunity or something like that. Those kind of things can happen too. Now, active immunity is when your body is making the components that fight off the infection. That's what active immunity is. Naturally acquired active immunity, we're going to spend a long time talking about, because that's basically what the immune system is doing, what we're concerned with in the adaptive immunity. How the cells of your immune system build up a resistance to and fight off infections of different things. Okay, so spend some more time with that. The artificially induced version of that is vaccines, where it's artificial in the sense that you're exposed to a potential pathogen that's not going to make you sick. And your own immune system is given time to work up an immunity to that. So when you are eventually exposed to that potential pathogen, you're prepared to fight it off. I expect that when you started being a student here, one of the things you had to do was to show a record of your immunizations, or I hope that's the case. When I was starting college, that was the case with me. I had to show what immunizations I had. I had to go to the doctor, I had to have a blood test done, they'd show what titers I had. I did not have a titer to chickenpox. I was never exposed to chickenpox as a child, and so when I was going to college at 18 or 19 or however old I was when I started college, I was not immune to chickenpox. At that time, the chickenpox vaccine had just been developed. So I had to start college, go get the chickenpox vaccine. So I was given a non-virulent form of the chickenpox virus, and my immune system, being exposed to that, developed an immunity to it. I didn't get sick because the chickenpox virus that I was exposed to was not virulent, was not capable of making me sick, but I now have an immunity to chickenpox. And I shouldn't have any problems if I'm exposed to it. Let's hope, because someday my son might get the chickenpox thanks to the Petri dish that we call in a daycare or something. And so hopefully I'll be exposed. I'll be protected against that. But that's artificially induced. So an intervention is necessary to get that started, but my system actively developed an immunity to chickenpox. Yes. Yes.
Even though you have a artificially induced vaccine for small chickenpox, would that leave you immune to smallpox?
Different virus. But I would have also gotten a vaccine against smallpox when I was a kid. That's one of the things that people are traditionally vaccinated against. And because of that vaccination, smallpox doesn't. I don't know that. I think smallpox is one of the things that's actually been eradicated.
I mean, maybe I'm confused. The one that is caused from chickenpox.
Oh, shingles.
Shingles.
I am not going to get shingles. And actually, when I had to go get the chickenpox vaccine, I did a lot of research to be sure about this. Shingles is basically getting the chickenpox again later in life, because the chickenpox virus is a little quirky. When you get chickenpox and you fight off that infection, you don't actually get rid of the chickenpox virus. Like if you get the flu and you fight off the flu, you clear the flu virus out of your system. But with chickenpox, what happens is chickenpox virus actually hides out in your body. It finds a corner of your body to hide out in that your immune system is not going to be able to fight it off or get rid of it. And where it finds is usually a dorsal root ganglion. And so later in life, if you're exposed to some sort of stressor that will sort of reactivate the chickenpox virus, it will cause chickenpox again, but just in the parts of your body that dorsal root ganglion is attached to. So if I had chickenpox hanging out in the dorsal root ganglion at this level right here, I get shingles on my skin right at that point. My wife's grandmother had shingles a while back before she passed away, and she had it right across this part of her forehead, which would mean that it wasn't in the dorsal ganglion, it's actually hanging out in the trigeminal ganglion, which is what's served by that particular, that's where the nerves come from, go to that part of the skin. My next door neighbor had shingles also. He had it in his throat, which is about the worst example of shingles I've ever heard of, which means that those viruses were actually hanging out in his geniculate or nodose ganglion. I can't remember which one, but sorry?
What was that again?
I can't remember which ganglion it is that serves the fibers that go to the throat, which I think are actually vagus nerve fibers, but so it was hanging out, it wasn't in dorsal ganglion. So there's some examples of shingles cropping up in weird places because it's not always dorsal ganglion, but usually it's a rash on some part of the skin. And it's that specific place because you can trace the nerve back to the ganglion where the virus got out. So, but being vaccinated against chickenpox virus, I don't have the chickenpox virus in my system. I won't have the chickenpox virus, so I'll never have shingles. You can drive down the road and see at a CVS or a Walgreens or something like that, get the shingles vaccine. Shingles vaccine is just a chickenpox vaccine. If you've already had the chickenpox, there's no need to get the shingles vaccine because it's not going to protect you against the shingles. If you've never had chickenpox and you get the shingles vaccine, it'll protect you against that. But I don't know if you are, a retiree driving down the road and you see the CVS says, get your shingles vaccine. If you pull in and say, I want the shingles vaccine, I don't know that they'll ask you if you had chickenpox or not. If you have and you get the shingles vaccine, then it doesn't really help at all. But maybe they go ahead and give it just to make people feel better. I don't know too much about how the how the shingles vaccine is handled exactly, but it really isn't any different than it is chickenpox, just recurring later on in life in a very specific way. Okay, so those are that's sort of a breakdown of immunity. We're going to look at innate immunity and then we're going to look at adaptive immunity. We're going to concentrate on the naturally acquired active immunity within this. I probably will point out vaccines again when we're talking about the immune response because it would be obvious how they fit in. And I'll talk a little bit about the naturally acquired, about passive immunity stuff where it comes up, specifically about protecting newborns, and the snake venom toxin serum thing might come up again too. Now, I already made this reference to this before, but let me just be explicit about it. What I want to do next is talk about what are the things that can cause problems in our body. What is the enemy? What's our immune system fighting against? And often I'll use metaphors to describe what's happening in our system that are kind of military or police oriented. And I said that earlier, that there are white blood cells that are like the police patrolling our body. I said something like that a little bit earlier. So there will be fighting and those sorts of things, or attacking the enemy. Those kind of ideas will come up, but really it's just cellular interactions. And we'll talk a little bit about those functions as we get into it in a bit more detail. But the best part about, or the most important part about understanding how your fighting force works is to also understand what you're fighting against. So I want to talk a little bit about what our enemy is in this fight. And those, for the most part, are what we call pathogens. Now, the word pathogen is similar to a number of other types of words that we're going to see in this, where it's something gen. And it's for pathogen, pathos comes from the Greek word that means disease or suffering. And the gen ending in this, and on all the other versions, comes from the same place that the word generate or genesis comes from. It's the Greek word that basically means to be born. So besides pathogens, things that cause disease, we're also going to be referring occasionally to things like allergens, things that cause allergies, or carcinogens, things that cause cancer, or antigens, things that cause antibody reactions. Those are some terms we'll come across. So anytime you see a word that's got gen at the end, it's something that generates whatever the rest of the word is referring to. So I want to talk about pathogens and just run through a few different types that are relevant here. The main type of pathogen that we're going to think of, not necessarily the, well, I guess it is kind of the main one that we have to deal with, are bacteria. Bacteria come in three different, well, wait, no, before I get into talking about that, let me set this up a little bit different. Normally I would write this stuff on the screen for the sake of the recorded version of this lecture, but I can't really do that from within a presentation like this. So I'm going to write up on the board. Bacteria belong to a group of organisms called prokaryotes. We belong to another group called eukaryotes. And I just want to talk about some differences between these. Now, these two words have at their root kary, K-A-R-Y, or karyo, which is from the Greek. It literally translates from the Greek as kernel, like popcorn kernel or something like that. But it's used in science to mean the nucleus of something. Okay. Pro in Greek means before, and eu means true. So prokaryote means before the nucleus. And eukaryote means true nucleus. And these two forms of life fall into two major categories that we think of in the history of biology. Prokaryotes are organisms that have existed the longest. They existed before the advent, so to speak, of the nucleus. They're very, very structurally simple organisms. And bacteria belong to this type of organism. Structurally simple. They often just have a cell membrane, some DNA, ribosomes, and a bunch of proteins to handle the internal workings of what's going on. Enzymes, cytoskeleton, that kind of stuff. That's about all that there is. So what I was about to say about bacteria is they come in three different shapes. So they're so structurally simple that we can classify this entire branch of biology into three different kinds of shapes. What we see on the picture on the screen here are rod-shaped bacteria, or bacillus. There are also spherical-shaped bacteria, which are called cocci, C-O-C-C-I. That's plural, C-O-C-C-U-S, the same guy. And you've probably heard reference to some of those. Pneumonia is caused by pneumococcus bacteria. Is that what it's called? Yeah, something like that. And that's just describing that it has a spherical shape. Okay. And there's also spiral-shaped organisms, bacteria, which I think are called spirochetes or something like that. Yeah. And that's as diverse as they get structurally. Okay. Eukaryotes, on the other hand, are structurally diverse. Oh, I should have written this down. I said this, but prokaryotes are basically cell membrane, DNA, ribosomes, and proteins. which could be enzymes or cytoskeleton, for example. Eukaryotes are very structurally diverse. They have true nuclei, which contain the DNA. They have membrane-bound organelles. And they're varied shapes of cells. Now, just within the context of this course, you've met a lot of different shapes of cells. We have epithelial cells, we have muscle cells, we have neurons, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a bunch of different types of cells just making up our own body. But eukaryotes encompasses a bunch of different types of organisms. Plant cells are eukaryotic. Fungi cells are eukaryotic. All of those types of different things that are not bacteria are eukaryotic. Okay? So they're very, very different structurally. Because of this structural difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes, people often think that bacteria are not very advanced and eukaryotes are very advanced, or simple versus complex. I'd like to suggest a different way of interpreting that. Prokaryotes, which include bacteria, have been around much, much longer. And so they've spent a lot more time adapting to their environment. Sure, they're not very different looking. We can classify them into just a few groups, but functionally or physiologically, they're very, very diverse. There are bacteria that can survive in locations that we wouldn't ever have imagined life could exist. And it was discovering these types of prokaryotes, sort of, which we call extremophiles, where we learn some very interesting things about life in general. There are organisms that live at the bottom of the ocean, so miles from sunlight or oxygen or any of that stuff, but they can survive because there's a type of prokaryote that uses the thermal energy that's released through the ocean floor. So the magma or whatever's underneath the crust, as some of that heat escapes, these organisms can use that heat the same way that a plant would use sunlight to drive the production of energy-rich molecules. And because they are there are organisms that live off of them and create a whole ecosystem down there. There are extreme types of organisms that live deep underneath the ice of Antarctica. They can live deep underneath the soil, so kilometers down in the crust of the earth, living off of radioactive elements that are in the ground around them, rather than, again, sunlight or anything like that at the surface. So we're starting to learn that prokaryotes can be very diverse in where they are interested in living, and have sort of reshaped a lot of our understanding of what life really means. Now, I'm telling you this partly because I think it's interesting, but really what we're concerned with for the immune system is a very narrow slice of prokaryotes. Prokaryotes that we are concerned about in terms of the immune system are ones that want to live in a environment of about 37 degrees Celsius, which is body temperature, and a pH of around 7.35, which is our internal pH. And depending on the particular organism, they may or may not need access to oxygen. Those are the types of organisms that want to get into our body, and they're going to make us sick. Prokaryotes that can live in these extreme environments that I'm suggesting, we don't have to concern ourselves with. So there are bacteria that are happiest at 70 degrees Celsius, which is I'm not going to be able to do the math in my head real quick. That can't be right. Nope, I'm not doing the math. I'm trying to do a quick conversion Celsius to Fahrenheit. Let's see, 5 goes into 70.
158.
Okay, 5 does not go into 70 158 times. But I'm assuming that you just did that conversion. Okay, sometime when we don't have class going on, I'm gonna have to try to do that conversion in my head because I'm curious. But I'll trust you that it's 158 degrees Celsius. Sorry, Fahrenheit. So those kind of organisms would not make us sick because they would die trying to exist in our body because it's far too cold for them or something like that. So, or it's just not the right environment for them. We only are concerned about the organisms that are looking for our environment. And part of our immune system will be able to fight them off by messing with that environment a little bit. Okay? And we're going to learn about how we can do some of that a little bit. Now, in this picture, I want to point out there's a scale bar at the bottom that says 1 micrometer. Okay? So this particular rod-shaped bacterium here is probably about 2 micrometers long, maybe 1/4 of a micrometer in diameter. Okay? This whole field of view is probably smaller than a red blood cell. Or we could take a red blood cell and cover up most of that field of view. Okay, so these are fairly small organisms here. This will be our common go-to example of a pathogen because probably bacteria are what we deal with the most. Now we have bacteria living in and on our body already. Okay. Some of them we've sort of set up a gentlemanly agreement with. They can live in our body as long as they don't make us sick, and we'll provide them with the environment that they need and the food that they want to survive. Sometimes that gentlemanly agreement gets out of hand and they say, we want more, and they make us sick or something like that. Or we're fighting off some other infection and we accidentally cause problems with their population or something like that. So, but there's a lot of bacteria that live in or on our body, and they're fine with that and we're fine with that. I've seen some references to the fact that there are more cells in our body that are not human than cells that are human in our body, which is to say there are so many bacteria living in and on our body, numerically they add up to more cells than the cells that actually make up our body that have our DNA in them. Okay. I haven't done the work on really researching that, but it sounds like it makes sense. And it's mostly because they're so small. 1 red blood cell would cover this field of view, and there's probably a few dozen cells within that field of view. So they're much, much smaller than the cells in our body, and they can easily outnumber us. Okay. And I really don't remember this, but I think I've also seen reference to the mass of our body that's made up of those cells. And you could probably lose quite a bit of weight by just getting rid of the bacteria in and on your body. Of course, you'd probably have problems if you did that, but they make up a significant portion of our body. Now, I want to introduce to you next another type of potential pathogen that we'll have to deal with a little bit because bacteria are a good example of your basic pathogen, not only because they're the things that we probably deal with the most, but also they're representative of most basic forms of life. This shows us viral particles. And viruses we have to think about separately because they're different from bacteria and other pathogens. They are not living organisms. To be a living organism, there are various criteria that something has to meet. Included among them are the ability to reproduce. And viruses cannot reproduce on their own. We take one of these viruses and put it on a petri dish with lots of nutrient molecules on it. We won't get a bunch more viruses out of that. That's not how viruses work. They work by infecting host cells and forcing those host cells to replicate the viruses. And that's why they cause disease, because they take over cells in our body to make more viruses. So we're going to deal with viruses specifically in a couple of situations because of how they're different from the general pathogens that we deal with. I want to point out a few other pathogens just to show you some variety. This picture shows fungal pathogens. I don't actually know what type of pathogen this is. I got the picture off of a website that doesn't exist anymore, or I should say that I don't have access to anymore. It was from an Army medical website. And it was this website that had pictures of a bunch of different things that were taken from urinalysis microscope samples. And so this is something that could be found in the urinalysis of somebody that's sick. And for Army medics, there was this great repository of everything. So as they're dealing with what might be novel to them experiences, they can look up quickly and have some reference. The website that this is on has probably now been put behind some sort of firewall security or something like that, and I can't find it anymore. But because of that, I don't actually know what type of organism this is other than it is a fungus. I chose this picture because fungi are eukaryotes like we are, but they're different from us. So the major types of eukaryotes are animals, plants, and fungus. And fungus is its own group because it has some things that are like animals and some things that are like plants. I chose this picture because it looks kind of like the branching pattern of, a tree or something like that, which would suggest the plant-like aspects of fungus. But then it's a parasite. It causes disease. There are not plant-based pathogens. There aren't plants that try to infect other people, other organisms, because plants make their own food through photosynthesis. They don't need to prey on something else. But fungus, which might have some plant-like aspects to it, do fall into groups of organisms that cause disease because they don't necessarily make their own food. There might be a type of fungus or two that does, but for the most part, fungi are parasites and decomposers. So they're found in our body causing disease sometimes. Then the last group are, I didn't back out to show the whole list, but are parasites. Parasites can come in two varieties. There are small single-celled organisms, which technically are a fourth type of life besides plant, animal, and fungus. They used to be called protists, but I'm not a general biologist, and I can't keep up with how things are changing. But over the past few years, what we used to call protists have different names now. But this is a single-celled organism. I just grabbed it because I thought it was pretty. This is another single-celled organism. I grabbed it because this is an amoeba, which is something that causes disease. When you're told not to drink the water when you travel to Mexico or something like that, this is the kind of thing you don't want to drink water for. This is a waterborne pathogen that can be found that causes severe intestinal discomfort. Now, I picked this picture because, one, we can see the nucleus of this cell, which tells us that it's a eukaryote, and sort of the texture of the cell shows us other organelles inside of it. Also, the way this thing moves is it reaches out parts of its cell membrane, and if it encounters something that it wants to move towards, then the cell will move that way. This type of movement, this amoeboid type of movement, is how white blood cells move also, and we'll see that later on in the material, not today. Okay. But it is a good single-celled type parasite that I could show you that corresponds to a couple other things that are relevant. Also, there are multicellular organisms that cause disease. Now, when I was making this presentation, it was one summer, and I was doing it during my lunch hour, right after I finished teaching in the morning. And never do a Google search for parasitic worm when you're eating lunch. Okay? This is the only picture I could even stomach to look at. But it was a really great picture to choose because we can see the multicellularity of this organism. So it has some sort of outer covering, which is its skin, an epithelial covering. And then the main thing we see going down the length of the worm is its digestive tract. These are smooth muscle cells, okay? Just like smooth muscle cells you see in our body. It's a little bit out of focus, but I think where we see this dark spot over here and a couple of other dark spots, I think those are ganglia, which would therefore be nervous tissue. And then the space in between its skin and its digestive tract, there's got to be cells in there, which would be connective tissue. So we see multiple types of tissue, multiple types of cells in this organism, just like we have. It's a multicellular organism. It's an animal. Okay. Here's another picture of a parasitic worm. I did not find this picture when I was doing my lunchtime Google search because I found it and I had it from somewhere else. This is what we call a hookworm. Okay. And it's the business end of the hookworm. We can see it has teeth, so it has some sort of connective tissue, bone-like structures. And it obviously has an outer covering, which would be an epithelial skin type thing. And then we're gazing at the entry into its digestive system, so it's obviously got some smooth muscle like the previous picture. Do you have a question? No.
You're staring.
No, I mean, I was just going to ask you, what do you think of the hookworm as far as its benefits?
We're about to go there. Okay. So this link down here at the bottom, you can click on that, or I've provided the same link, whoops, in the immune system material. It says Hookworm Podcast. Okay. So the link that was just there on the picture would take you here. This is a website for what's called Radiolab. It's a radio program that I'm familiar with originally because it's on the public radio, NPR network. They're based out of New York City. It's actually made by the radio station WNYC. And they do a, I think, fairly weekly radio show. It's an hour-long thing that they usually pick some topic and look at it from a fairly scientific point of view. Usually they're getting a little bit away from that these days. And so this is a page that goes to an episode that's about parasites. Now, if you click on the back to episode link right here, the whole parasites thing here is broken down into different parts. There's a section here, the section that we're just in. So this is about a parasite that causes cockroaches to become zombies or something like that. And then down at the bottom, it's talking about toxoplasmosis gondii, which is cat scratch fever stuff, which I've actually come across a couple of things the past couple of weeks referring to that. And the most weird one was road rage can be blamed on that particular parasite. So cat owners apparently have more road rage than dog owners. Anyways, if you want to listen to a whole thing, you can. But this Sculptors of Monumental Narrative is a portion of this overall program that's about hookworms. And it has two components to it. The first half is about the Rockefeller Commission and how they kind of learned how things like hookworm cause problems and what we should do to help out society in general by dealing with them. And then the second half is a story about this guy, Jasper Lawrence, who has a very different relationship with hookworms. So what I want to do is I want to play this podcast for you. Now, it's 23 minutes long. So I'm going to start it today, and we're going to finish it up. Today's Tuesday, right? Yeah. So I'm going to finish it up on Thursday. So what I think I'll do is I'll play the Rockefeller half of it today, and then we'll listen to Jasper Lawrence at the beginning of Thursday. If you just can't wait for Thursday, you're welcome to listen to the rest of it, but we're going to listen to it on Thursday. Now, it is hosted by two guys, Jad Abumrad, who is a sound engineer producer who makes great use of radio to really connect you with the story. And then Robert Krulwich, who is the NPR science correspondent. If you listen to NPR, All Things Considered, that kind of thing, he's usually the guy that's talking about any science topics, but he's based at WNYC. So let me play the first part of it, which is probably about 10 minutes long at tops. And then I'll stop it before it starts the second half, and we'll pick that up next time. And hopefully this is live.
Hello, I'm Jad Abumrah.
And I'm Robert Krulwich.
This is Radio Lab. Our topic today,
Parasites.
parasites.
Now, we've met them, they're nice, and we've met them when they're not so nice.
I don't know that we've met any nice ones, really.
Oh, we haven't? I thought that
Oh, the
Carl was
bug flutes.
yeah,
They were
Carl
pretty
was
nice.
flutes.
Yeah, they were nice.
So, and now the question is, let's just talk about scale. I mean, for the most part, they're irritating and little, and they seem kind of
Invisible.
and sort of off stage.
Yeah.
But when you back off a little bit and consider them, in the effects that they have on the world,
There are actually these powerful sculptors of monumental narrative.
in other words, these are little guys telling very big stories.
In fact, here's an example. Recently, I went to visit a guy named Dixon Despommier at Columbia University. He's a parasitologist, and, well, he does a bunch of different things. We ended up talking about, well, he told me this crazy story.
The story I love telling the most.
Oh, and before we start, I just want to say one thing. The following two stories contain moments that are a little bit gross. Just want to make sure you've been warned.
The story I love telling the most is how we eradicated hookworm.
The story begins in 1908.
John D. Rockefeller Sr.
A really rich guy is sitting in his New York office, and he's thinking,
How can I make more money selling something to the South?
yeah, I've got all this money, I've got all these resources. I just need a new market. In terms of new markets, the South was pretty much untapped. If only those damn Southerners.
We just get off their butts and get going.
Problem was, they weren't. They weren't getting off their butts.
The farms were not operational. The economic engine was turned off.
The economy was in the toilet, and so John D. Rockefeller wanted to know why.
Why aren't they producing more?
What's happened to their economic engine?
So he thought,
I know, I'll form a commission.
yeah,
So he sent out a bunch of economists and sociologists and people like that on the original Rockefeller Commission. They did everything a commission could possibly do to try to find out why these Southern gentlemen were not rising to the occasion. And they came back with the following conclusion. Well, we don't exactly know what's wrong, but we think that these people are sick from something because they don't behave like we do.
what does that mean?
They are slow, not mentally. They're slow physically. They're pale. I'll give you an example. Remember the movie Deliverance?
Sure.
Okay. Remember that little guy that played the banjo?
I remember the other scene that we all
Yeah,
We're not going to talk about
No,
that.
we're not. No, we're not. If you could recall what that little banjo player looked like. A little wiry looking guy, but he looked old.
Sickly, pale.
Yeah, sickly pale, and yet an adult.
Well, wait a second. That is not a description of all Southerners.
No.
It's a description of
No.
one teeny corner in a.
No, but what the commission did say about a lot of these Southern people they encountered is that a lot of them, they just don't look right. They look weak, they look wan, they look kind of
They were wan.
pale, lethargic,
It's interesting. Wan or wan?
wan.
You choose.
So the thought was that maybe these Southerners had some kind of laziness disease. This is really what a lot of folks thought. But one member on the committee suggested to Rockefeller, you know what? Perhaps these people are anemic.
Anemic. They're anemic, you say? Yeah, they're anemic. Sounds like a medical problem then. Maybe they're not lazy after all. Maybe they're anemic, and maybe they're just weak.
Next thing you know, Rockefeller puts together another commission, this one with doctors, and he sends them back.
Back down to the South to find out what the basis for the anemia was. And not only did they find anemia, but they found a correlation of the anemia with soil types. That's bizarre. Sandy, loamy soils, anemia. Hard-packed clay soils, no anemia. Sandy, loamy soils, good farmland. Hard-packed clay soils, not such good farmland. So all the rich farmers were anemic, and all the poor farmers were doing okay.
And this seemed to be a clue. The incidence of anemia was linked somehow to the soil. Maybe, bum, bum, bum,
Yes.
something was in the soil.
That's correct. So somehow they hit upon this idea of looking for hookworm.
The hookworm.
The hookworm.
So they thought, all right, let's run some tests.
When they did, big time. They discovered hookworm big time. So the anemia is due to hookworm.
Now the question became, how are these Southerners getting the hookworm and giving it to one another? And a pretty good place to start to look for an answer was their feces. Because if these hookworms are in you, they're going to come out of you when you go to the bathroom. So they asked these Southerners, when you guys defecate, where do you do it? Most of them said something like this.
And I defecate over there. See that tree over there? That's where I defecate. So I defecate over there, but I live over here.
Okay, so then the investigators asked the next question. When you go to that tree and do it, do you wear any shoes? Most of them said no.
Barefoot, just like everybody else. Because it's comfortable.
So clearly these worms are in the feces that are landing near the tree, that are somehow getting into people's feet the next time they come to use the tree. But no one intentionally steps in their own, no one does that. Which meant...
Oh my goodness, it can crawl. Right, so let's find out how far it can crawl.
So what they did, these researchers, is they built a sandbox. And then they took some hookworm-infested stool
And put it right in the middle. Then every day, we'll sample from the stool sample out in the sand in all directions and find larvae and find out how far they can travel. How's that sound? So now we have larvae in the stool, and they begin to crawl away from the stool, seeking a victim. On day one, they crawled an entire foot in all directions, but they weren't at 2 feet. On day two, my God, they're at 2 feet. At day three, they're at 3 feet. I can't believe this. They're crawling a long way. Day four, they crawled to 4 feet.
What about day 5?
I'm allowed to ask
Okay.
that. And what about day 5?
5 feet?
No,
No. 4 feet.
That's it.
So after 4 feet, they're what, exhausted?
One would assume on day 6, they were still at 4 feet. And on day 7, they were dead. So how in the world could you deal with this problem when these worms can crawl? They can crawl 4 feet. It doesn't matter where you defecate. They're going to crawl away from that. And within a 4-foot radius of that stool sample, you're going to get hookworm. Unless you do something radical that's never been done before. They devised a scheme for burying the stool sample into the ground 6 feet deep.
Because if the worms can only make it 4 feet, well, then that's 2 feet past the point where they die.
We call that the outhouse. So the outhouse was invented by exploring the life cycle of hookworm. And in fact, Rockefeller got his wish. The South did rise again.
That sounds too easy to me, though. Yeah, but you're telling me that an understanding of hookworm, which created the outhouse, removed the, quote, Southern laziness disease, and they did rise?
I do.
And you bring that all back to the hookworm?
I do.
Really?
No, I believe bring it back to sanitation.
Now, to be fair, you can find plenty of other reasons why the South rose again.
air conditioning and highways and universities
Right.
and stuff like that.
So the hookworm had some help. But what is clear is that when we as a country began to distance ourselves from our own excrement, to put it bluntly, when we stopped walking around in our own there were all of these unintended consequences.
Salmonella disappeared. E. histolytica disappeared. Shigella disappeared. Cholera disappeared. Giardia disappeared. Cryptosporidium. Anything that's associated with parasites in feces disappeared. Every time we built outhouses and people used them religiously, guess what? Their kids could stay in school longer. They could learn more. They got ahead faster.
Dixon Desmamier is a professor of public health and environmental health sciences and microbiology at Columbia University.
Can they make longer titles at that university?
He literally wrote the book on parasites.
The book is called Parasitic Diseases. You know it very well. It's soon to be a major motion picture, but now it's 4th edition.
In its 4th edition.
And while we're on the subject,
Okay, so that's the end of the Rockefeller thing. They're about to start the second half. I thought that they said in there, maybe they do in the second half, how hookworm actually works. So it has those lovely teeth down there. When you walk through soil that they crawled through, they will bite through the bottom of your foot, get into your bloodstream, and then use the bloodstream to get around your body, and they'll find their way to your intestines, where they'll move out of the bloodstream and into the intestines and start eating your intestinal wall. Okay. And then they will have babies, and those babies will travel through the rest of your intestinal tract and come out in your feces, and then crawl 4 feet from the source and hopefully find a new host to infect. I thought they said that there when they were talking about the latrine, but maybe they explain in the second half. So we'll finish listening to this podcast, the Jasper Lawrence part of the story, which will eventually answer the question you were actually asking to begin with. And we'll consider what this means for understanding the immune system a little bit. So see everybody, well, see half of you tomorrow and the rest of you on Thursday for class.